There are official records that list 31 men assigned to Black Pine Lumber Camp No. 7 in the autumn of 1891. By winter's first snowfall, only 27 names remained on payroll. No bodies were returned to their families. No letters were posted explaining resignations. No graves were formally marked. What survived instead were fragments: a supply ledger amended in hurried handwriting, a foreman's private journal that stops mid-sentence, and a complaint filed by a freight driver who swore the forest was making sounds it had no right to make. Locals later claimed the camp had been built somewhere it should not have been. Others insisted exhaustion and isolation had simply turned men against one another. But when the Hardrove Timber Consortium dissolved Camp 7 without inquiry and paid the widows in cash with no questions allowed, something far stranger began to take shape. Chapter 1, Where the Light Never Reaches. Have you ever stood somewhere so quiet that the silence did not feel empty, but attentive? Not peaceful, not restful. Attentive. Black Pine Corridor had that sort of quiet. In the autumn of 1891, long before forestry maps were complete and before survey lines had properly tamed the mountains of northern Oregon, the corridor was a stretch of old-growth forest so dense that daylight arrived in diluted form. Even at midday, the ground lay in a kind of dim half-light. The bark of the trees, slick with constant moisture, looked almost charred. Camp 7 sat at the very end of a wagon track carved from mud and stubbornness. 2 days by mule from the nearest settlement, 3 if rain had softened the road. Once a man arrived, leaving was not a casual decision. The workers simply called it 7. The structures were rough but functional. Bunkhouse, cookshed, tool store, timber sled lines. Smoke lifted lazily from iron chimneys most mornings. The air carried resin, damp soil, wool, and wood smoke in equal measure. 31 men worked under foreman Ogden Harshaw that season. Harshaw had spent decades moving west with the logging trade, from Michigan's cut-over forests to Washington Territory, and finally south into Oregon's deeper mountains. He was 47, broad-shouldered, measured in speech, and known for outlasting weather that broke younger men. Authority followed him without effort. The crew itself was a mixture: Swedes with axe-scarred palms, Irish riggers who swore fluently in 3 dialects, farm boys who had never seen trees so tall they seemed to bend the sky. They worked 12-hour days felling Douglas fir and cedar so wide it took 2 men just to wrap the saw around the trunk. Isolation did strange things to men. It stretched conversation thin. It sharpened temper. Still, the first weeks of autumn passed without more trouble than blistered hands and a snapped cable line. Then the animals began to behave oddly. Mule teams refused certain parts of the hauling path, not stubbornly, not theatrically. They simply stopped, ears forward, nostrils wide, and would not proceed until led in a wide arc around a particular cluster of trees near the eastern boundary. The cook claimed the meat barrels were being disturbed at night. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just shifted. And twice, before dawn, a few of the men reported hearing something that did not belong to wind or wildlife. A low, rhythmic thud. Slow, deliberate, as though an axe were striking wood far off in the forest, long before the morning bell. Harshaw dismissed it at first. Sound carried strangely in heavy timber. Echo bent direction. Fatigue did the rest. But by the end of October, 4 men had independently described the same unsettling detail. The blows came in groups of 3. Then, silence. If you're listening to this alone tonight, you might understand why that detail matters. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Some forests keep their silence differently, and I'm always curious how far these stories travel. And if stories like this interest you, consider subscribing. The darker corners of history, even fictional ones, deserve careful listeners. Because what happened next at Camp 7 was not noise carried on the wind, it was something closer. Next we discover why one logger followed the sound past the marked boundary, and why, before morning, the forest floor held footprints that did not match any boot at the camp. Chapter 2. The boundary. Marked in chalk, it began with a wager. Not the loud, foolish kind shouted across a tavern table, but the quiet sort made at the edge of fatigue when pride outweighs caution. The man who stepped beyond the marked boundary that October evening was not reckless by nature. His name was Elias Rowe, 28 years old, hired just 6 weeks earlier, steady with a crosscut saw and slow to speak. He had been one of the 4 who heard the blows. 3 strikes. Pause. 3 strikes again. The sound came just before dawn, when the forest held its breath between night and morning bell. Each time it had carried from the eastern edge of their cutting line, beyond the chalk marks Harshaw used to signal where felling should stop until winter survey. "No one's working out there," the riggers insisted. "No crew assigned," the cook confirmed. Harshaw said little, but that afternoon Elias noticed something new. Fresh scarring on the bark of a fir just inside the boundary line. Not the broad gouge of a falling tree, not bear marks. Cleaner than that. Too clean. 3 shallow cuts, level, evenly spaced. By supper, curiosity had hardened into unease. The camp's routine continued as always. Tin plates, beans thick with salt pork, boots drying by the stove. But conversation circled the same topic like men pretending not to circle a fire. It was Elias who finally said, quietly, "If someone's cutting in our stand, we need to know." No one challenged him. They simply watched Harshaw. The foreman stared at the stove door, jaw working once before he nodded. "No heroics," he said. "You walk the line, that's all." Elias took a lantern. No rifle. There had been no suggestion of threat, just investigation. Another man offered to accompany him, but he refused. The boundary was less a fence and more an understanding. Chalk marks on bark, strips of cloth tied to lower branches. Beyond that line lay timber scheduled for next season, dense and largely untouched. The forest shifted as he crossed it. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but the quality of the air changed. The ground felt softer underfoot, layered with years of needles and rot. The canopy thickened enough that even lantern light seemed swallowed quickly. He paused, listened. Nothing at first. Then, faintly, a creak. Not wood under strain, wood under weight. He lifted the lantern higher, its glow licking at the trunks around him. The cuts were there again. 3 shallow marks on a cedar this time. Fresh sap still beading along the grooves. The rhythm echoed in his memory. 3 blows. A chill moved through him, though the night was not especially cold. He stepped farther in. The thud came without warning. 1 strike. Somewhere ahead and to the left. He froze. Counted the seconds. 2, 3, 4. Second strike. Closer. He swallowed, heart climbing into his throat, and realized the sound was wrong in one small but undeniable way. It carried no echo of metal, no ring, no vibration, just a heavy, blunt impact against living wood. The third strike fell, and with it his lantern flickered violently. He did not recall moving backward, only that suddenly he was no longer alone in the clearing. The sense of presence did not announce itself with footsteps or breath. It pressed inward from every direction. The silence afterward was worse than the sound. Elias did return to camp. But he returned pale, mud to his knees, lantern extinguished, and with a detail that unsettled even Harshaw. He insisted the cuts on the trees were not made by axe at all. They were impressions, as though something heavy and flat had been pressed against the bark with deliberate force. Next we discover what Elias found tangled in the undergrowth near the boundary marker, and why, by morning, 1 bunk in the camp would be empty. Chapter 3. The Empty Bunk. By the time the first grey hint of morning filtered through the canvas-covered windows of the bunkhouse, most of the men were already awake. Not because of the bell, because of Elias. He had said very little after returning from the boundary, only that the marks were wrong, that they were not cut, but pressed, that something was standing in that timber, striking without a blade. Then he had sat on the edge of his bunk, hands resting on his knees, staring at nothing in particular, while the cook poured him coffee he did not drink. Eventually, exhaustion claimed him, or seemed to. When dawn properly arrived, and the men rose to lace boots stiff with yesterday's damp, it was one of the younger workers who first noticed the bunk across from Elias was empty. Not unmade. Empty. The blankets were folded with strange care at the foot of the mattress, the pillow placed upright against the wall as though arranged for inspection. The missing man was Thomas Kerr, a quiet Scotsman in his early 30s who had arrived at the same time as Elias. He had shared saw duty with him for weeks. His boots were gone. His coat was gone. But his tin mug remained on the crate beside his bed, half filled with water from the night before. Harshaw stood at the center of the room for several seconds, eyes moving from bunk to door to window. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned crate, no boot tracks visible on the hard earth floor beyond what the entire crew had already pressed into it over weeks. "Check the privy," he said. They checked. Nothing. The tool shed. Nothing. The cookhouse. Nothing. The eastern path. That was where the air began to feel different. The men did not speak as they walked in a loose formation toward the boundary line. No one wanted to be first to comment on what each of them was thinking. It had rained lightly in the night. Not enough to wash tracks away entirely, but enough to soften the soil into a readable surface. There were footprints. A single set leading from camp toward the chalk-marked trees. Thomas's boots were distinctive, one heel slightly worn on the outer edge. The prints matched. He had walked deliberately, not run, not stumbled, but just beyond the boundary mark, where the forest thickened and the ground dipped toward denser undergrowth, the tracks shifted. They did not vanish. They simply changed direction abruptly, as though he had pivoted sharply to face something behind him. Behind him. The men turned instinctively toward camp. Nothing stood there now. No movement between the trees, no glint of light. Yet several of them later admitted they felt watched in that moment, not from ahead, but from the direction they had just come. The second set of impressions appeared several feet beyond Thomas's last clear print. They were shallow, wide, and wrong, not paws, not hooves, and not boots. 3 long depressions pressed into the softened soil, arranged roughly in a triangular pattern, as though something heavy had rested weight unevenly upon the earth. Harshaw knelt without touching them, measured them with his eyes, said nothing. Then quietly, back to camp. No one argued. By midday the search had expanded outward in cautious sweeps, but Thomas Kerr did not reappear. No torn clothing, no blood, no broken branches, only those marks. And just before dusk, Elias, who had not spoken since morning, made one final, quiet observation. "The blows," he said. "They weren't ahead of me." He looked toward the cookhouse, toward the yard where mule teams stood tethered. They were coming from behind. Next we discover what Harshaw ordered built before nightfall, and why, after darkness settled, the first scream carried from inside the camp itself. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely coincidental. Chapter 4. What they built before dark. Harshaw did not waste daylight. Whatever he believed, whether it was a prowling animal, a man cutting into their timber, or something he would not yet name, he understood one thing clearly. Thomas had walked out of the bunkhouse and had not returned. That alone demanded action. By noon, he had the crew dividing timber not for hauling, but for reinforcement. They were to bring the forest inward. The men worked in uneasy silence, felling smaller firs and dragging them into the central yard. Instead of preparing logs for sledging, they sank them upright around the main cluster of buildings. A crude palisade, not high enough to stop something determined, but enough to define a boundary, enough to make a statement. We are here. We are together. You are not welcome. No one said those words aloud, but the rhythm of axes felt different that afternoon, defensive, tighter. The mule teams grew agitated as the day waned. Harness chains clinked more often than usual. One animal snapped its tether without provocation and had to be calmed by two men together. By late afternoon, the barrier stood complete. Rough posts hammered into damp earth, gaps filled with brush and debris. There would be a single entrance, narrow enough that a man had to turn sideways to pass through. Harshaw stationed two men there at dusk. Elias was not one of them. He had not resumed saw duty. He moved slower than usual, eyes scanning the tree line as though reading something invisible written between trunks. The forest felt closer. That was how several of them described it later, though none could explain what that meant. The trees had not moved, and yet the yard seemed smaller. The line between cultivated ground and wild growth no longer felt like distance. It felt like a membrane. Supper was brief, conversation thinner than ever. Even the cook, usually a steady presence, avoided meeting anyone's gaze. Night arrived without spectacle, no storm, no wind. The men settled into the bunkhouse fully dressed, boots beside their beds, lantern turned low rather than extinguished. Harshaw took position nearest the door. Hours passed. At first, there were the ordinary sounds of forest night. Insects, distant branch creak, an owl's uneven call. Then even those diminished. The quiet returned, attentive. Just past what must have been midnight, the first blow came. Not from the eastern boundary this time, from the palisade itself. One impact against timber so close the bunkhouse walls seemed to pulse. Several men bolted upright before the second strike landed, lower this time, nearer the ground. The third hit with enough force that splinters cracked inwards somewhere along the barrier. No metal ring, no blade, just pressure. Harshaw moved first, lantern in one hand, rifle in the other. He threw open the bunkhouse door. The yard lay still in pale lamplight. The barrier stood intact. The two guards at the entrance were on their feet, rifles raised, faces drained of color. "You saw it?" Harshaw demanded. They shook their heads. He stepped forward and froze. At the base of one upright post, the wood was indented. 3 deep impressions pressed into the grain. Fresh, resin bleeding. Before anyone could speak again, the scream tore through the camp. Not from beyond the barrier, from inside it. Next we discover who was missing from the yard, though no gate had been opened, and why the ground within the palisade now bore marks no one remembered making. Chapter 5. The space between the posts. For a moment after the scream, no one moved. It was not the sound itself that held them still. Men in logging camps were no strangers to sudden pain or panic. It was the direction. The cry had come from within the yard, inside the barrier they had built. Harshaw swung the lantern toward the tool shed first. Its door hung half open, swaying slightly though there was no wind. Shadows trembled across stacked cross-cut saws and coiled cable inside. "Count off," he ordered. Names were called in uneven voices. 26. 27. They counted again. 26. The missing man was Calder Finch, one of the guards posted at the entrance. His partner stood rigid, lips pale, rifle trembling in his grip. "I never left the gate," the guard insisted. "He was right beside me." Harshaw stepped toward the entrance. The narrow gap between posts remained secured with a crossbeam. Untouched, no sign of forced passage. The earth directly beneath it bore only the overlapping impressions of boots from earlier shifts. But 5 paces inside the yard, closer to the tool shed than to the barrier, the soil had been disturbed. Not in a scattered struggle, in a pattern. 3 depressions, deep, broad, pressed cleanly into the damp ground. And beside them, the partial print of a man's heel dragged sideways. Calder's. The drag mark ended abruptly. Not faded. Ended. The men circled the impressions instinctively, as though stepping too close might wake something sleeping beneath the earth. The lantern light shifted across the yard, catching nervous faces, tightening jaws. No blood, no torn fabric, only silence thick enough to feel in the throat. "Search every structure," Harshaw said quietly. They did. The bunkhouse was intact, the cook shed undisturbed, the storage crates unopened, even the mule pens held steady, though the animals' eyes rolled white and restless. Inside the tool shed, however, Elias paused. Against the far wall, leaning upright, stood a logging maul, a heavy splitting hammer used for wedges. It was not assigned to Calder, and yet its wooden handle bore fresh resin streaks near the grip, as though pressed, not swung, against something that bled sap. Elias did not touch it. He simply stared. Behind him, one of the younger workers whispered something that went unanswered. It was not until Harshaw reassembled the men in the yard that the deeper unease began to surface. "How does a man disappear from open ground?" someone murmured. No one offered an answer. The barrier had not been breached. The gate had not been opened, and yet 2 men were now gone. Harshaw made his decision without raising his voice. "No one alone," he said. "Not for any reason. We hold until daylight." They returned to the bunkhouse in pairs. No one slept. Just before dawn, when fatigue blurs the line between thought and dream, a faint sound drifted through the yard again. Not striking this time, scraping, slow, measured. As though something heavy was shifting weight along the outer wall of the bunkhouse. Elias lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams, and realized something that chilled him more than the disappearances. The blows had stopped. The thing in the forest no longer needed to knock. Next we discover what Harshaw finds when morning light reveals the outer wall, and why one of the men begins to insist the forest is not trying to enter the camp, but contain it. Chapter 6. What the morning revealed. Dawn did not bring relief. It brought clarity. A thin grey light filtered into the yard, revealing the barrier posts in hard detail. Every knot in the wood, every seam where brush had been wedged between trunks. Nothing had collapsed. Nothing stood broken. But the bunkhouse wall told a different story. Harshaw stepped outside first, rifle held low but ready. The rest followed slowly, boots heavy on damp earth. The air held a strange stillness, not the expectant hush of early morning, but something denser, final. The outer wall of the bunkhouse faced east, toward the boundary where Thomas had vanished. 3 long impressions had been pressed into the timber planks overnight, not gouged, not split, pressed. The wood had bowed inward under force, fibers compressed into pale streaks where bark met grain. The shape was unmistakable now, wide at the top, narrowing slightly toward the base, with a faint curve along one side, like the edge of something broad and weight-bearing. Elias stepped closer than the others dared. He placed his palm against the indentation. Cold. Colder than the surrounding wood, though the morning itself was not harsh. He pulled his hand back quickly, as though he had touched stone left in winter shade. "It wasn't testing," he said under his breath. Harshaw glanced at him, but said nothing. The mule teams were the next to draw attention. One had not made a sound all morning. They found the animal lying on its side within the pen, eyes open, breath shallow but present, no visible wound, no broken limb, just a stillness in its body that looked wrong, as though something had leaned against it long enough to draw the strength from its bones. The ground around the pen was marked with those same impressions. 3 at a time, always 3. No one spoke of abandoning camp. Not yet. Instead, Harshaw ordered a wider sweep beyond the barrier, not a search for Thomas or Calder. He had already understood that search would not yield bodies in any familiar sense. This was reconnaissance. Pairs moved outward carefully, rifles carried but not raised. The forest beyond the palisade felt altered. Even the usual scent of resin seemed thinner. Then Elias called out softly. He stood 20 yards from the camp near the old cedar, marked with shallow impressions days before. Only now the bark there had changed. The marks were deeper, and below them, at waist height, cloth had been caught in a split of wood. A strip of dark wool, Calder's coat lining. It had not been torn. It had been pressed into the tree itself. Harshaw approached slowly and examined the trunk. The grain had separated under pressure, then closed again around the fabric, as though the tree had been pliable for a moment. That was impossible. And yet the evidence lay there. One of the men backed away, crossing himself without ceremony. Elias did not move. He had been replaying something in his mind since before dawn. The pattern of blows, the sequence, the locations. Forest edge, barrier, bunkhouse wall, mule pen, closer each time, closer to the center. He looked back toward camp, then toward the cedar. "They're not random," he said quietly. "Nothing about this is random." Harshaw's voice, when it came, held the first trace of strain. "What are you suggesting?" Elias hesitated only a moment. "It's not trying to get in." The men around him shifted uneasily. "It's closing us in." The forest canopy overhead seemed heavier suddenly. Light dimming through the sun had risen higher. And then, faint but unmistakable from somewhere deeper beyond the survey line, one blow. A pause long enough to feel deliberate. Second blow. The third did not come. Next we discover what happens wet, and Harshaw decides to break the boundary himself. And why stepping deeper into the timber may be exactly what the forest has been waiting for. Chapter 7. Crossing the line. Harshaw did not hesitate. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing against the camp, the rhythm of those 3 blows still echoing faintly in the distance. Something had shifted overnight. The barrier they had built was no longer a line of defense, but a cage. The men understood it instinctively, though none spoke the fear aloud. "Gather the others," Harshaw said. His voice was low, calm, but every man felt the edge beneath it. "We move beyond the chalk marks. Together. Now." Elias followed closely, lantern held high. He noticed the forest ahead looked wrong, the light dimmer, the air thicker, almost tasting of resin and damp earth, yet bitter in a way no man should notice at breakfast. Every step forward felt like moving through a memory, rather than space. The first few paces beyond the chalk marks brought a silence that was absolute. No wind in the branches, no call of birds, not even the scuttle of small animals. Only the crunch of their boots on the soft forest floor. Then Harshaw stopped. 3 deep depressions pressed into the ground, arranged triangularly, like the same sequence they had seen near the camp. But these were larger, wider, staggered irregularly, as if the forest itself had shifted its footing. The men exchanged glances, but Harshaw only muttered, "Keep moving." Elias noticed a faint glint in the undergrowth. A fragment of something metal? No. Closer inspection revealed it was a broken strap from Calder's pack, almost perfectly clean, as if placed there deliberately. The forest had left them a clue, or a warning. As they advanced, the trees seemed to lean in, narrowing the path, filtering the already weak sunlight into bands that moved like fingers across the ground. The rhythmic 3 strikes echoed faintly, now coming from all directions, each one impossibly near, then far, then near again. It was impossible to tell where the source lay. And then Elias realized it was not a rhythm made by a man, not even by an animal. It was measured, deliberate, like the forest itself was counting. Harshaw paused again, squinting at a gnarled oak with bark torn in long, vertical slashes. He stepped closer, hand on the trunk. The cuts were fresh, not from tools, from pressure, deep enough to leave impressions of human-sized fingers. A whisper carried through the branches, not words but intent, something watching, waiting for them to step farther. Elias swallowed, heart thudding, and Harshaw's hand dropped from the tree as he spoke quietly. "We've crossed the line. There's no turning back." Next we discover what the men encounter in the heart of the timber, and why one logger's scream will mark the forest forever.
Did you know in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, logging in the forests of the Pacific Northwest, including Oregon and Washington, was one of the most dangerous occupations in the United States? Historical studies show that in the early 1900s, roughly 1 in every 150 loggers in Washington died each year on the job, and injuries were extremely common due to unsafe conditions, primitive tools, and the sheer weight of old-growth timber. There were no safety regulations, limited medical care, and many camps were remote, primitive, and isolated, meaning injuries often proved fatal simply because help was too far away. Loggers worked long hours with axes and early saw, lived in crowded bunkhouses, and faced frequent accidents from falling trees, kickbacks, where trunks fell unpredictably, and heavy cable machinery failures. This harsh reality is part of why logging law grew so fearsome. Real danger was woven into every day deep in the forests.
Chapter 8. Into the heart of timber. The deeper they moved, the quieter the world became. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping forest, but a suffocating, expectant hush, as if the trees themselves had paused to watch. Every footfall seemed magnified, every snapped twig echoing unnaturally through the dense stands of fir and cedar. The light had thinned so dramatically that even the lanterns cast only narrow cones of glow, leaving shadows that seemed to move when no one was moving. Elias stayed close to Harshaw. He noticed details that seemed wrong. The undergrowth was flattened in unnatural swaths, forming paths that twisted and looped in patterns no human hand had designed. Moss grew in stripes along the ground, as if brushed aside in deliberate lines, and always the faint, irregular pulse of those 3 blows lingered at the edge of hearing, never far, never consistent. Half an hour into their cautious advance, the first scream ripped through the forest. Not distant, not muffled. It came from inside the men themselves. One of the younger loggers, Henry Doyle, fell to his knees, clutching his ears, screaming a sound that was not entirely human. The others grabbed him, but he struggled violently, eyes wide with terror as though he were seeing the forest move. Harshaw barked orders, steadying his own fear. "Keep together! No one splits off!" Elias shone his lantern toward the source of the scream. In the faint light, he saw a clearing, small, irregular, ringed by trees too close to be natural. Within it lay the footprints of Calder and Thomas, but they were distorted, enlarged, stretched in places, and the impressions of those same 3 deep depressions appeared again, repeated across the ground like a warning or a ritual. Harshaw knelt to examine them. The spacing, it's deliberate. Someone, or something, wants us to follow. They did not argue. The arrest seemed to pulse in anticipation, almost urging them onward. Elias noticed something else. The shadows between the trees were thickening unnaturally, branches intertwined to form shapes vaguely humanoid, shifting when caught at the corner of the eye, vanishing when looked at directly. The air smelled of resin, but with a sour undertone that made his stomach churn. Henry's screams subsided, replaced by whispered mutterings he did not understand. Harshaw pulled him close, placing a heavy hand on his shoulder. "It's not real, lad. Keep moving." But everyone knew it was real enough to bend the rules of thought, to bend time itself. The rhythm of 3 blows continued, closer now, echoing off bark like deliberate taps marking their progress. The heart of the timber was near. They could feel it. Next we discover what waits at the clearing's center, and why stepping into it may change everything for the men of Camp 7. Chapter 9. The clearing at the center. The forest opened suddenly, as if someone had pulled back a heavy curtain. The clearing was small, roughly circular, surrounded by towering firs that bent inward at impossible angles. Sunlight filtered through in thin, pale beams, highlighting a ground carpeted with damp needles, broken branches, and the faint, almost imperceptible impressions of something much larger than a man. Harshaw held the lantern high, scanning every inch. The impressions of Calder and Thomas led here, yet the men themselves were nowhere in sight. Their footprints ended abruptly at the center, replaced by the same triangular depressions they had seen across the camp, larger, more defined, pressing deep into the soft earth. Each depression seemed to hum faintly with weight, as though the forest itself had mass and intention. Elias stepped closer. He noticed something in the middle of the clearing, a tree unlike the rest. Its bark was smooth, almost polished, but marred with deep, vertical gouges, arranged in a pattern he could not decipher. Resin bled slowly from the cuts, glistening like fresh blood under the weak sunlight. Then he noticed the air. The wind had stopped entirely. No rustle of leaves, no bird calls, not even the faint whisper of distant water. The forest had gone utterly still, as though holding its breath. Harshaw moved closer, boots crunching over the needles. He saw a shadow stretching along the ground, cast by nothing in particular. A long, lean shape that shifted as if alive, but detached from any tree or branch. Suddenly the rhythmic 3 blows echoed again, this time from all directions at once. Each strike seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath their feet. The men instinctively crouched, pressing their hands to their ears, yet the sound continued, impossible to locate or silence. Henry Doyle whimpered behind Elias, pointing at the base of the strange tree. There, partially buried beneath layers of needle and moss, lay fragments of leather. Pieces of Calder's coat, Thomas's boot, and something else. A small carved wooden token, triangular in shape, worn smooth at the edges. Elias picked it up, fingers trembling. Symbols were etched into its surface, crude yet purposeful. They were not letters, not numbers, something older, more primal. The moment his skin touched it, the 3 strikes seemed to synchronize, beating directly beneath their feet in perfect rhythm. Harshaw inhaled sharply. It wants attention. It wants us to see it, understand it. A low moan seemed to ripple through the trees, and Elias realized the forest itself was moving imperceptibly, guiding them inward. Next we discover what the token represents, and why Elias will be the first to understand that Camp 7 was never meant to exist. Chapter 10. The Token's Secret. Elias held the triangular token tightly, feeling its weight and strange texture. The wood was old, far older than anything a man could have carved recently, and the symbols etched into it seemed to shift when he blinked, subtle changes in line and curve, like the forest itself was breathing through them. Harshaw peered over his shoulder. "Where did that come from?" he asked quietly. He already knew the answer. Instinct told him this token had been placed deliberately, for them to find. Elias traced the etchings with a finger. 3 parallel marks intersected by a diagonal slash, forming a shape that matched the impressions in the earth they had followed from camp. The rhythmic blows, the depressions in the ground, even the strange disappearance of Calder and Thomas. It all pointed to this token. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence. Not a blow this time, not a strike. A soft, dragging sound coming from deeper within the clearing. It was faint at first, then louder, deliberate, measured. The men froze. Henry's eyes were wide with terror. "It's moving," he whispered. Harshaw signaled for calm. "Stay together. Do not provoke it." The token seemed to vibrate slightly in Elias's palm, as if resonating with the forest. He realized with a chill that it acted as a key, not to open a door, but to understand a pattern. Each blow, each impression, every disappearance had been orchestrated, leading them to this very spot. Then Elias noticed it. The 3 deep depressions at the center of the clearing shifted slightly, as though something unseen was repositioning itself, responding to his gaze. "Harshaw," Elias said, voice trembling, "I think it's aware we're here." Before anyone could reply, a faint shimmer appeared between the trees, like heat rising off the forest floor in the summer. The shape was indistinct, a dark mass folding, in on itself, yet it carried intention. It was drawing their attention, pulling the men closer. Harshaw gripped his rifle tightly. "Keep your wits. Do not run. Whatever it is, it's testing us." Elias felt a pull toward the token, and suddenly understood that the object's purpose was more than symbolic. It was a warning, a guide, and if they misread it, the forest would decide their fate. Next, we discover what the forest demands, and why the first man to obey will set in motion a chain of events no one can reverse. Chapter 11. The Forest's Demand. The forest waited, not in silence, not in passive stillness, but as though every branch, every root, every living thing was holding a single thought, a single purpose. Elias felt it pressing against his chest, thickening the air around him until it became nearly impossible to draw a full breath. Harshaw studied the token in Elias's hand. "It's not a tool," he muttered. "It's a message, or an instruction, something demanding." The ground trembled faintly beneath them, enough to stir needles and small branches, and then a sound began. Not the rhythmic 3 strikes of before, but a low, resonant hum, almost musical, vibrating through the soles of their boots. Each man felt it in a different place: chest, skull, stomach. Henry whimpered, curling into himself. Elias realized something that made his stomach turn. The impressions, the blows, the disappearances, all of it had been a trial. And now, standing at the center of the clearing, the forest's expectation became clear. It wanted recognition, attention, submission. Harshaw stepped forward, scanning the clearing, fists clenched. "What do we do?" Elias felt the token pulse faintly in his palm, resonating with the earth beneath him. He lifted it toward the center of the clearing, where the deepest triangular depressions lay. As he did, the hum intensified, echoing against the trees like a chorus. Then the ground shifted, not violently, but deliberately. The impressions widened, forming a triangular pattern that matched the token exactly. Harshaw frowned. "It wants us to—" "What? Step inside?" Elias nodded slowly. "It's a pattern, a sequence. The forest has been guiding us here for days. Every strike, every impression. It's a map. We follow it, or—" He swallowed hard. "We don't leave." A shadow moved at the periphery of the clearing, almost imperceptible. It was larger than any man, broader than a mule, yet it remained just beyond vision. The 3 deep impressions seemed to quiver, as though the presence itself acknowledged Elias's understanding. Henry muttered something under his breath, but the words made no sense. "We shouldn't—" Harshaw cut him off, voice firm. "No more hesitation. We do this together." The men formed a circle around Elias as he stepped carefully into the first depression. The token pulsed, and the ground beneath his boots sank slightly, as if recognizing the action. And then the hum transformed into a voice, not human, but intelligible, resonating directly inside their minds. One phrase repeated over and over: "Complete the sequence. Complete the sequence." Next, we discover what happens when the first man obeys the forest's command, and why that single act will set in motion events the camp can never reverse. Chapter 12. Following the Sequence. Elias took a deep breath and stepped fully into the first depression. The token's pulse seemed to align with the rhythm of his heartbeat. The forest responded immediately. The hum intensified, vibrating through the earth, through the trunks of every tree, through the very air. The triangular pattern of depressions glowed faintly in his mind's eye, though no light shone in reality. Elias could feel the ground guiding him, almost like a trail underfoot that only he could sense. Harshaw and the others followed cautiously, each stepping into the corresponding impressions. The moment they did, the air itself seemed to constrict and then release, as though the forest was breathing along with them. It was Henry Doyle who faltered first. He refused to step into the next set of depressions, trembling violently. "I can't. I won't," he whispered, backing away. But as he moved, the 3 blows sounded again, this time from all around him. The depressions deepened, as if the earth itself reached for him. Henry screamed and stumbled backward into a tangle of roots. Elias reached for him, but Harshaw's voice stopped him. "Do not break the sequence." Elias's hands shook as he realized the stakes. Every step, every placement into the ground was not just a ritual. It was survival. If one man faltered, the consequences rippled through the clearing, through the sequence, through everything the forest had been orchestrating. The rhythm of the blows became faster now, almost impatient. Elias felt a strange compulsion to continue, even as fear gnawed at his mind. The token vibrated stronger, pulling him forward, guiding him toward the center of the triangular pattern. He noticed the forest responding in real time. Trees leaned slightly, shadows shifted, undergrowth retracted, all opening a narrow path to a point he could not see yet. The pull, as from the token, matched the vibrations beneath his boots, and he realized it was communicating. A warning, a directive, an inevitability. The others followed, silent, except for the occasional gasp as the ground shifted beneath them. Every man understood that stopping now was not an option. The forest demanded obedience, and it had been orchestrating this moment from the first strike, from the first impression, from the very disappearance of Calder and Thomas. Elias took the next step, feeling the sequence flow into him, and the forest seemed to sigh in relief. But he knew the hardest part was yet to come. Next we discover what the clearing conceals at its very heart, and why completing the sequence may not save them, but could change them forever. Chapter 13. The Heart of the Clearing. Elias stepped carefully into the center of the triangular pattern. The token pulsed violently now, as though thrumming in time with some hidden engine beneath the earth. The forest seemed to bend inward, every tree leaning, every branch angling unnaturally to form a dome of shadows around the men. Harshaw and the others closed the circle behind him, faces pale, eyes wide. No words were spoken. The hum filled the space between them, vibrating through bones and nerves. Henry Doyle remained frozen at the edge, shaking, too terrified to advance, yet unwilling to leave the circle. At the very center of the clearing, the earth had shifted slightly. 3 depressions merged into a single hollow, perfectly triangular, and in it lay something that was both carved and alive. A mass of twisted roots and sap-streaked timber intertwined, forming shapes that looked almost human. A grotesque mimicry of Calder and Thomas, frozen mid-step, eyes closed, faces turned toward the sky. Elias felt the token draw in his hand, almost burning. As he stepped closer, the hum transformed into a voice, low, ancient, echoing in his skull. Complete. Obey. Return. Harshaw's voice trembled. It's not just a pattern. It's a trap. A warning. The forest pulsed in unison with the token. Shadows shifted. Branches quivered. The impressions in the clearing deepened. The men's boots sank slightly, as if the earth itself sought to pull them down. Every instinct told Elias to stop, to retreat, to refuse. But the pull of the token was irresistible. He placed it into the hollow at the center. Immediately the hum became a resonant chord, vibrating through the clearing and along the trunks, flowing out into the forest. The shapes of Calder and Thomas trembled, their features softened. They appeared almost human again, yet something essential remained. Altered. A wind swept through the clearing, chilling but without movement. The 3 deep impressions surrounding the hollow glowed faintly, and the forest seemed to relax, though uneasily. The pulse of the token slowed, and for the first time in days, silence returned, thick, heavy, but not hostile. Harshaw exhaled sharply. It's done. For now. Elias studied the figures in the hollow, the shapes of Calder and Thomas frozen between life and forest. Whatever the clearing had demanded, it had been satisfied. But the forest had marked them, all of them, forever. Next, we discover what happens when the men attempt to leave the clearing, and why the forest may not allow them to return to Camp 7 unchanged. Chapter 14. Leaving the clearing, the forest waited. Not with malice now, but with an almost sentient patience. The token had been placed, the sequence completed, and yet the clearing seemed reluctant to release the men. Every step away felt heavier, as if unseen hands pressed against their backs, slowing their movement, measuring their resolve. Harshaw led, rifle held low but ready, eyes scanning every shadow. Elias followed, the token safely tucked into his coat pocket, still pulsing faintly as if it remembered its place at the center of the clearing. Behind them, the other men shuffled, tense, whispering prayers or muttering curses under their breath. Even Henry Doyle, pale and trembling, kept moving forward, though he kept glancing over his shoulder at the hollow in the clearing. The impressions in the earth remained behind them. 3 deep depressions, now fading slowly, merging into the soil as if the forest was swallowing its own markings. The rhythm of the blows, the hum, the low voice, all vanished gradually, leaving an oppressive, anticipatory silence in its wake. As they walked back toward the palisade, the canopy above seemed to lift slightly, letting through streaks of morning light they hadn't seen before. Birds called tentatively, the wind whispered faintly through the needles, and even the mule teams, restless the night before, had settled quietly in their pens. Harshaw stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked back. "Whatever this is, it doesn't like to be disturbed," he said. His voice was calm, but the tension in his jaw betrayed his unease. "It lets us leave, but it remembers." Elias's gaze lingered on the forest beyond the clearing. He realized with a chill that the deeper sections, places no surveyor had mapped, no logger dared tread, had shifted subtly, almost as if paths had changed overnight. What had been familiar now felt as alien, alive, and aware of their every movement. They crossed the chalk marks again, stepping back into the part of the forest they had once called known territory. Yet it no longer felt safe. Not fully. The rhythm of the 3 strikes, the impressions, and the token's pulse had left something behind, a sense of being measured, observed, and partially claimed by the forest itself. The men reached the palisade and paused. Harshaw tapped the crossbeam. "We rebuild, not walls, but boundaries. The forest, tests, yes, but we survive only when we respect it. Remember that." The clearing faded behind them, swallowed gradually by the dense timber, as if it had never been there. Yet the memory, the sense of the forest's weight, the strange pulse, and the transformed impressions would stay with them forever. Next, we discover what awaits at Camp 7 itself, and why even the familiar buildings may not be entirely safe after the forest has touched them. Chapter 15. The Camp Aftermath. Returning to Camp 7 felt like stepping into a place both familiar and foreign. The palisade stood, intact yet somehow diminished, as if the forest had tested its resolve and decided it was only a temporary boundary. The bunkhouse loomed like a silent witness to everything that had happened, but even its familiar wooden walls seemed altered. No one spoke at first. The men moved like shadows, boots heavy on the damp earth, eyes darting to the tree line as if expecting the 3-strike rhythm to return at any moment. Harshaw signaled them to assemble in the yard. "We've survived the forest's test," he said quietly, voice carrying across the open space, "but it doesn't forgive mistakes. It only waits for the next one." Elias felt the token pulse faintly in his pocket, a reminder that the forest's influence was not gone. Calder and Thomas were never seen again, yet their absence hung over the camp like a second canopy, dark and suffocating. The men spoke sparingly, trading nervous glances, each acutely aware that something larger than them had claimed part of the woods. Even routine tasks, feeding the mules, chopping kindling, securing logs, were performed with an almost ritual caution. Every footstep, every movement was measured against an invisible observer. The familiar rhythms of camp life had been replaced by a new, unspoken hierarchy. Men obeyed, watched, and waited. That night, Harshaw patrolled the yard with the men, lanterns swinging, ears straining for the faintest anomaly. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. The canopy above seemed heavier than ever, shadows pressing inward. Yet the pulse of the token reminded Elias that the forest's attention lingered, patient and unyielding. By dawn, the camp felt stable again, but the memory of the clearing, the impressions, and the rhythmic strikes remained etched in every man, his mind. Even as they resumed work, cutting timber and hauling logs, there was an understanding. Camp 7 was no longer merely a logging site. It was a place marked, observed, and shaped by something ancient, something that existed beyond human understanding. Elias looked at the token one final time. He knew the forest had left its mark on him, as it had on Harshaw and every man who had stepped into the clearing. And though they would continue to work, continue to live, they would never forget. In the black pine corridor, silence is alive. The forest remembers, and the shadows are patient. The camp continued, but a part of every man remained in the heart of the timber, where the clearing waited, still pulsing, still counting, still watching. The end.